Our next speaker is Professor Ruth Irwin, okay, who's coming from the University of Aberdeen School of Education. Her researches are mainly about climate change and philosophy. In addition, she is interested in various post-structuralist thoughts, such as Heidegger's Deleuze and sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it correctly. Is it Deleuze?
Deleuze,
yeah, okay. And indigenous philosophy. So today she is going to present Maori philosophy, Heidegger, and the temporal of the earth. So, Professor Irwin, now the table is yours.
Thank you. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Ruth Irwin, and I am a New Zealander, Pākehā, of Irish descent. And I tell you all of that as the paper unfolds, you'll start to realise more and more why I'm telling you these sorts of things. So I have had two research interests for most of my career. One is in Indigenous philosophy and decolonialism and culture contact, and on the other hand has been in continental philosophy. And for the first time really this year, I'm bringing the two things together. So it's quite an exciting period for me, and hopefully for you all as well. So I want to position myself quite clearly too, because I am Pākehā, which means basically white in New Zealand. I'm very quite cautious really about the way that I leverage Maori philosophy, and I always make sure that I present my work in a Maori context. So this is not the first time this has been presented, and it is a sort of a constant conversation. So in this paper, what I'm going to do is look at several poets. The first one is Hone Tūwhare, and this is one of Hone Tūwhare's poems here, or at least a small excerpt from one of Hone Tūwhare's poems, and also look at one of his friends who was a painter and a sculptor called Ralph Hōtiri. And I'm interested in three interrelated concepts and concerns. The first is whenua, which means land or placenta. Two words that are very different in English, but in Māori they mean the same thing, land and placenta. In other words, the umbilicus, the people, is the same as the land. The second is whakapapa, which means genealogy, and it also means taxonomy or categories. And the third is about death and the ancestors and cycles. And I want to bring those three ideas into juxtaposition with Heidegger and some of what Heidegger's been talking about. So lovely to have your paper first, because it really sets the scene really nicely, so thanks, it's great. So what Heidegger does, actually just before I carry on with that, so Heidegger, he has a methodology that is about what he calls the two beginnings. And you talked a little bit about the first beginning, the Ursprung, the origin. Because a lot of my work is on climate change and looking at the impacts of climate change, the Gestell, the Bestand and all of that, what I'm most interested in this paper anyway will be on the second beginning, which is where he's looking at the finitude or the end point of a civilization and the way that it refracts back on the decisions that we make in the now. And in that, in other earlier works, I've spent a lot of time talking about how productive that is. It's a very interesting idea. It gets away from this progressive teleological thing that Hegel sets up and that many, many other philosophers in the Western tradition have gone with, this teleological notion of progress. So he really abruptly cuts that off, and he does it by talking about death and finitude and refusing this notion of an eschatology or an afterlife. But what I want to argue is that actually it doesn't quite do the work that he has wanted it to do. Because he's constantly talking about finitude, it lends itself to a sort of a form of civilization Armageddon, and climate change itself becomes this Armageddon. So it is almost another eschatology, it's just a secular one. And this in itself is a problem, and it's one of the reasons why we haven't managed to escape from from still, we are completely mired in a system that is producing climate change. So it's to Maori philosophy that I'm going to look to set up some new ways, or different older ways in a way, ways of thinking about this eschatology of finitude. So Heidegger gets away from some of the worst forms of Westernization or Europeanization, and particularly the subject-object split that we were referring to before, by talking about language as the house of being. So he gets away from the sort of individuated, liberal notion of the subject by re-emphasizing or shifting the emphasis from one individual to language as a whole. So a civilization as a language community. And you could see that the language of English has become just this sort of globalized planetary house of being, as he would put it. So in this simple phrase, he amplifies interpretation from the individual subject to the historical language community. Interpretation is irreducibly subjective, he argues, something along Descartes' I think, I am, that conjoins thinking and being without closing the interpretive gap between the subject and object completely. Humanity's significance is our ability to consciously comprehend being, Heidegger would argue, distinguished from mere existence. And these are some of the ways that Heidegger importantly reworks sceptical philosophy, opening up space for art and for poetics, and for the earth to reappear in new forms of truth, just as viably as deductive logic. Nature forges the ground for humanity and for other species. But Maori philosophy takes this a step further. The concepts of whakapapa and whenua bring earth and people into the same conceptual basis. Whenua means both land and womb. Whakapapa is our ancestors, the layers and layers of generations of the human and the more than human. And I argue that these concepts show how Heidegger remains captured by the modern and Christian framework of time, being, language and finitude, whereas whakapapa sets out our evolution in an ongoing time frame and one not curtailed by finitude, neither in terms of personal death nor the Armageddon of a civilization itself. This is an excerpt from a book by Ruth called, if I can remember, The Impressionists. And I wanted to, I was working on this paper and I came across this just when I was, reading the novel, but I really liked it. It really helped to understand what I'm trying to do here. So this is just a short excerpt from his work, but he says, the ancestors kept turning the year and bringing forth more harvests, which fed more children who became adults and then died and became ancestors in their turn, helping to spin the year, the ancestral force always growing stronger, powering the footsie world through a kind of mythic perpetual motion. Now the machine was broken. Now there were the old times and the new. Maybe the missionary brought the past and future with him in his saddlebags when he rode through the land, talking about the high God and the dead God and the end of time. He left little else but that, the idea of a beginning and an imminent end. He told people to think about their own endings and about where each one of them would be when there was no more time. Instead of asking the ancestors, what is right for us to do, people started to say, what is right for me? What will happen to me now in these end times? And I think this is a beautiful illustration of the shifts that colonialism wrought in all kinds of cultures that understood ancestors. The whole notion of ancestors. It's really hard for a Western ear to hear that. Don't you? Are you noticing that? I'm noticing a bit of wriggling and jiggling. What happens there is we start to go, oh, that's pagan, or it's not proper. It's not proper thought to think about ancestors. So I want to suggest that actually it's more proper than we could ever imagine. So in Maori cosmology, everything is connected. And I want to talk a bit about this concept of whenua. So whenua literally means placenta, it means umbilicus, and it means land. People are the land, and this is philosophically important. At its root, whenua is inhabiting, nurture, co-regulation. It's not about the relationship to the land. It's not the juxtaposition that Descartes talked about between subject and object. It is immanent in the land. The relation is family. It's the womb. It's the occupation of the body, the occupation of the place. It's intimate, loving, and pulsating like blood circulating through the mother's body, through the placenta, and through the fetus. Tangata whenua literally means people land. There's no conjoining word, not even and or in. People are the land. Being is immanent and both together. Whakapapa means the long line of descendants that have died and continue to enliven the living world through the evocation of their important deeds. The dead travel to Rarohenga, which is protected by the goddess Hini Nui Tupo. The dead are not inhabiting an afterlife so much as imminently cogent in the evolving landscape. Death has evolved into a narrative. The land embraces the mana, which means the power, if you like, or importance of the dead, and nurtures or enriches the lives of those presently walking in human feet, who are themselves tangata whenua, people, land. Often in everyday speech we hear reference to the ancestors. In every mihi on marae, that's every greeting, each welcome in the meeting house, the ancestors are greeted along with the people who are present. The land is present in the grammar, even in English translation. So we say on the marae. The marae is the meeting space. And in English you tend to say you're on the land, but in Maori you won't. You just say you are the land. So whakapapa is usually translated as genealogy or of descendants, but its literal meaning is layers, it's strata. Has anybody read Deleuze and Guattari, Thousand Plateaus? Yeah, so it's the same sort of idea. It's it's about the strata of rock conjoining together. And what's less well known about this concept is that it also means it's an important taxonomy of classification. So it's not actually just about your human ancestors, it's about all the other species, which in Maori cosmology, we're all related. So we're related to the trees, we're related to the animals, we're related to the stone, we're related to the river. None of it is outside, it's all one set of relationships. So this is a quote from a woman called Cheryl Itirangi. And she says, whakapapa, which is usually translated, I think I've got this somewhere. Yep. Whakapapa, which is usually translated as genealogy or descent, lays out Māori views of existence, the human and natural world. It provides explanation for existence and also articulates the human role within that existence. Within whakapapa, there are origins and explanations for trees, birds, parts of the human body, words and speaking, the cosmos, the gods, karakia, which means prayers, the moon, the wind, and stones. All life is connected and interrelated. Appropriate behaviour is also indicated to all aspects of life within whakapapa. In Māori cosmology, all elements of existence have wairua or Māori. Things are immanent with life force or breath. Stones too have Māori as much as human beings. And there is no distinction between existence and being, which for Heidegger there's a massive distinction between existence and being. So in Honi Tūwhari's poem, Rainmaker, Poem for Whina, by the way, this is Honi Tūwhari, the poet that I'm looking at. And this is the poem that I have in mind. This poem, this woman here, Whina Cooper, she's a very famous activist in New Zealand politics, and she led a land march which was about the loss of Māori land. And this was one of her speeches, which Honi Tūwhari has turned into a poem. So she said, "No more lollies. We've been sucking the Pākehā lolly for 150 years. look at what's happened. Look at what we've got left. Only 2 million acres. Yes, that's right, 2 million acres out of 66 million acres. She goes on. So you listen now, this is a sacred march. We're marching because we want to hold on to what is left. You've got to understand this, and you must think of your tupuna, that means your ancestors. They are marching beside you. Move over and make room. We're not going to Wellington for nothing. So I really want you to notice that she's telling the living people that are actually walking to move over and make room for the tupuna. The tupuna are the other, not just the human ancestors, but the other species, the stones, the land, the sea, the trees, the rock. So the ancestors are the taxonomy of all things, all bound in intimate family connection. Not only beings are invoked with whakapapa. Depending on the skill of the orator, often there's the story of the beginning, which might refer to the long night of Tepo, the nothingness out of which all things arose, or other tales of the later gods or heroes and their struggles. Each event associated with specific landmarks which memorize that history and tales. So the land itself embodies stories, and the stories embody the land. Takirangi Smith explains how each tribe is directly integrated in their territory through whakapapa, through this genealogy. So he says, whakapapa kōrero, which means the speaking of this taxonomy, which includes the whole gamut of whakapapa, karakia, waiata, and narratives and other discourses, are held sacred and critical to the tangata whenua group. That's to the group that belong to that bit of land. I've indicated that tangata whenua, the people, the land, discourses are location-specific, and as discourses within their own spatio-temporal reality have their truth value located in particular environments. So in an oral tradition, Māori is an oral tradition, landmarks forge an intimate bond with memory and with historical narrative. And specific landmarks trigger memories that are passed on through the generations. And I'll give you a really good example. Last summer I was in New Zealand, and I was talking to a friend of mine, Te Haumoana White, who is a chief in a particular fairly small tribe, and he was talking about the tainui trees, and he showed me this grove of trees that were growing on a hill, and these tainui trees turned out to be actually part of the original waka, the original canoe that had come over to New Zealand, about 800, 900 years ago. And this little part of this canoe had been stuck into the ground and it had sprung. And, now you have this grove of trees. So to a Pākehā eye, to a settler eye, you would just go down the road and just see some trees, scrubby trees, you wouldn't even notice them. But for Māori, that grove of trees were incredibly important because they show that's their origin story. That's how they arose. That's how they got there. So those are the tainui trees. So everything in the landscape is like that. They can tell you that there are particular stories about that particular place. So Hone Tūwhare and Ralph Hawtrey, the poet and the painter, had an amazing relationship over many, many years. And they were both, in their different genre, they were both expressionist rather than representational. And again, this bounces back to the conversation that Heidegger had with Descartes. Descartes was talking about representing the object, and Heidegger's going, representation is not really what it's all about. It's a relationship, a contradistinction between subject and object, which is expressive rather than representational. So these two are particularly good at this kind of expressiveness. Tūwhare's writing articulates ordinary lived life in vivid colloquial language, daily events, short and long held emotional tones. His writing evokes ancient and contemporary discourse in a liminal space that navigates the pre-colonial and the post-colonial in ancient and emerging ways. And a lovely example. So this is the pair of them speaking with one another. Hone Tūwhare on the right, Ralph Hawtrey on the left. And these are some of Ralph Hawtrey's paintings. He was a sculptor as well as a painter. And here you can see that he's actually used Hone's poem in his painting. So he uses writing quite a lot. And here's a lovely example of a post-colonial painting of Ralph Hawtrey's. So obviously this is the British flag, right? You can see this is actually a sort of a caricature of the New Zealand flag, which has the British flag in one corner of it. And it also says NZ, New Zealand, which obviously it's not in Maori, it's in English. In Maori, the land is called Aotearoa, which means land of the long white cloud. So this is a very colonial piece of work. And this is another lovely example of Hawtrey's artworks. So he's talking a lot about the land, or he's painting about the land and the whakapapa of the other species. So in this, you can see there it says pine. See it? Pine trees are a colonial species. They don't belong in New Zealand. They were introduced. So radiata pine, there's massive, forests of monoculture radiata pine. But pine also means, to pine, it's sad, it's sadness. So he's talking about pining for when the land was healthier and wasn't covered in these foreign trees. So it's a sort of a post-colonial, and he did hundreds of them. This is just a few examples. Right, so him to roll through things. Right, so one of the things that I really, really wanted to talk to you most urgently, I guess, in this talk is that both Hone Tūwhare and Heidegger, both coming out of the Catholic tradition, are a little bit obsessed with death. So here is a Hone Tūwhare poem about it's about a tangi, which means a funeral. It's about death. So he says, drifting on the wind and through the broken window of the longhouse. A longhouse is always, it's a communal house, it's a meeting house. Where you lie, incantatory chant of surf breaking and the mass and the mountain talking. At your feet, 2 candles puff the stained faces of the whānau, that's the family. The vigil of the bright Madonna, sea, sand whipped, and the toy church does not flinch. E moi e te whaia wahine rangamarie. So what he's doing there in the first stanza is he's talking about the mountains talking, the chant of the surf, and that's really what death is about. It's about returning to the land, returning to the sea, and becoming the ancestors, the 28 to 30 generations that they can recount of ancestors in the past, but also into the future. So it's not this notion of finitude, it's about planetary continuity. And the second stanza is really taking Christianity and turning it into a puff of smoke, right? At your feet, 2 candles puff, stained faces of the whānau, the vigil of the bright Madonna, sea, sand whipped, and the toy church does not flinch. So he's being very post-colonial. He's trying to situate Christianity as a specific historical event and not as the meaning of life. Again, this is his friend Ralph Hawtrey's paintings using his poems. Oh, that's the same one. Right, so here I wanted to shift gears a little bit and start talking about Heidegger again. Heidegger, who also, this is Tordenau, where he had a little hute in the forest. So he's also very, very engaged with the land. But he has this very different perspective, which is what I mentioned before, these 2 beginnings. So as we had from the previous speaker, this really eloquent description of the first beginning. And in the first beginning, he goes back to the classics, particularly Aristotle, and he really thinks about the first beginning as being a seed that thrusts into time. So there's no genealogy there, there's no women there, there's no womb there, and there's no ancestors there. It doesn't go backwards in time, it's just one origin point. It's very masculine. And the second one is this notion of finitude. that we are going to die. Personally, we're all going to die, each one of us. But also that the civilization itself will die. It will come to an end. And in a way, that's a really radical point, you know, that we hardly ever think about, and something that's really worth contemplating. But again, I want to suggest that it is part of our problem, because it brings us back to climate change all the time. He uses Rilke, the poet Rilke, a lot. Partly, he thinks Rilke is a you know, incredibly important poet, because Rilke talks about death all the time. So here you have a small chunk of a poem by Rilke where he's talking about a sister remembering her dead brother. And she says, "The dark shape of coolness ever follows the wanderer over the footbridge of bone, and the boy's hyacinth voice softly reciting the forest's forgotten legend." And you can see that what Rilke is doing is quite similar to what Hone Tūwhare is doing. He's really evoking nature. He's evoking the forest in death. But what I would argue is that it's probably got more to do with Christian, like Pascal, right, for example. So Pascal talks about how important the human being is compared to all other species, because we are conscious. We have this wonderment. We are capable of really approaching consciousness of being, right? This grounding attunement of the first beginning is deep wonder that beings are, that man himself is extant in that which he is not. And what's more, we have the second grounding attunement, which is the second beginning, the finitude, is startled dismay at the abandonment of being, the finitude, the ending. So I want to suggest that what Indigenous thought brings to us is a notion of continuity instead of this concept of Armageddon, and that we need to be able to start thinking beyond the now and into the future, 20 or 30 years into the future. 20 or 30 generations into the future, not just this generation, right? Not just absorbing and constraining and everything in the now. So I'll leave it there.